Okay, so I'm Twyla Ruby, Associate Curator here at DeRosa, actually rather a Curatorial Associate. But I'm going to be leading us through a short presentation, doing a close reading of Lynn Hershman Leeson's really interesting piece entitled Constructing Roberta Breitmore, which is all to do with the construction and performance of feminine identity. And part of the performance of feminine identity that is depicted in the piece is the wearing of a platinum blonde wig. So in honor of that, we've mixed a cocktail called the Platinum Blonde, which is delicious. And I'm going to be sipping that while we talk about the piece. And I do have my chat window enabled here. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to throw out during the presentation, feel free to do that in the chat and I can respond in real time. And then I'll also try and leave a few minutes at the very end to respond to any questions that were left unaddressed. Okay, so I chose to highlight this piece in the second installment of Cocktails with the Curator because it's always really spoken to me the most out of almost any other piece in the DeRosa collection from my perspective as sort of a young woman in the social media age, because it's all about the construction and performance of feminine identity. So even though it was created in the 1970s by Lynn Hershman Leeson, it anticipates a lot of really relevant issues that we're dealing with today. And so I hope to highlight some of the ways that it is connected to current concerns of young women today. So I've given us a detail of the piece on this opening slide here. You'll see the full piece in a few slides, but this detail really shows a few things about the piece. So what the piece is it's a construction chart showing how Lynn Hershman Leeson constructed her sort of alter ego, which was named Roberta Breitmore, using makeup. So this is a construction chart showing how to use different kinds of makeup in different parts of the face to create this persona of Roberta Breitmore, who Lynn Hershman Leeson personified and embodied for a period of 10 years, beginning in 1973. But what's really interesting to me that you can really see in this detail is how the face looks kind of bloodied and like there's violence has been done to the face. So for me, one of the really interesting things about this piece is how it shows how the construction and performance of female identity is really kind of linked to violence that is visited upon the feminine body. And I think that that's even more true now than perhaps it was in 1975 with the proliferation of social media, et cetera, which I hope to discuss. So I will return to constructing Roberta Breitmore in a few slides, but before I talk about that piece, I want to talk a little bit about the prehistory of the piece by highlighting, so this, the piece grew out of a site-specific installation that Lynn Hershman Leeson did in San Francisco in 1973 at the Dante Hotel in North Beach. So to understand Roberta Breitmore, you have to understand about the Dante Hotel installation. So I'm just going to talk about that for a few minutes. Okay, so in the early 1970s, Lynn Hershman, as she was known then, was an up-and-coming artist working in the new field of media art. And she was scheduled to have a show at the UC Berkeley Art Museum, but because her show included lots of new media, including a sound component, the curators rejected her work and refused to show her work in the museum. And as a result of that rejection, she began this practice, which has continued for decades, of showing her work in alternative spaces and in kind of liminal spaces all around San Francisco and the Bay Area. So the Dante Hotel is the most famous example of that. So when she was rejected from the Berkeley Art Museum, she rented out a room in this Dante Hotel in North Beach, along with her friend and collaborator, Eleanor Coppola. They rented out 2 separate rooms, and created these two site-specific installations in these hotel rooms. And we believe that these were two of the first site-specific installations anywhere in America. Lynn Hershman's installation in room number 47 was really interesting. She have a photo of the interior of the room here. She left sort of the detritus of a lived life all around the room, including used toothpaste containers, used makeup things, discarded clothing. So she made it look like a lived-in room. And she also put two wax figures, two women, two wax heads in the bed that made it look like two women sleeping together in the bed. So then she invited visitors to come in at any time, 24 hours a day, to be in this environment, this found environment, she called it. So she sort of took inspiration from Duchamp's idea of the found object. And what she was trying to create was a found environment that you could just walk into. And so she was inviting visitors to come into this space and kind of imagine the life that had been lived in this space by an unnamed fictional character. And you see on the wall there, she's superimposed some writing to kind of explain what she was trying to illustrate with this piece. She talks about the negative space of life that was lived inside this room is what she was trying to represent and illustrate. So this piece was up for a year in the Dante Hotel. Eleanor Coppola's piece was only in there for 2 weeks, as opposed to Lynn Hershman's piece was in there for a year and received a lot of coverage in the art press. After a certain amount of time, it was reviewed by Thomas Albright, who was a major critic in the San Francisco Bay Area at that time. And it was also reviewed in some major national art publications. So this really kind of put her on the map. But so it was up for a year until a visitor came in 1973 and saw these wax heads in the bedroom and mistook them for live corpses and called the police. And then the San Francisco Police Department cleared out the whole installation, thinking it was a crime scene, I guess. So that was the end of the Dante Hotel installation, but it was up for about a year. Here I have a registration slip for a period that was late in the installation period. It closed, I believe, in late 1973, having begun in 1972. One thing I wanted to point out is that the person who's rented the room here is Lynn Hershman. So one common misconception about Lynn Hershman's work is that the Dante Hotel installation and the Roberta Breitmore series that we're focusing on today were one and the same, part of the same artwork, when in fact they were separate artworks. They were shared a lot of the same concerns, but they're sort of photo negative of each other in ways that we can discuss. So I wanted to point out that the person who rented the room here is Lynn Hershman and not Roberta Breitmore. And so unlike in the Roberta Breitmore series, Lynn Hershman has not yet adopted the alternative sort of alter ego or alternative persona of Roberta Breitmore in doing this site-specific installation in the Dante Hotel. So I wanted to emphasize that while Roberta Breitmore grew out of the Dante Hotel installation, they're two distinct pieces, as you can see in this reservation slip. Because Lynn had not yet adopted this strategy of adopting an alternative persona, which is what she ended up doing in the Roberta Breitmore series, which began the same year in 1973. Okay, so if what she was doing in the Dante Hotel series was about depicting the negative space of a lived life by leaving around the objects that fictional characters had used in inhabiting this space, this hotel room, the Roberta Breitmore series is kind of the complement or like photo negative of that. Okay, so this is the piece that we have in our collection. It's entitled Constructing Roberta Breitmore, and you see it's sort of a map for how to construct this persona using makeup and a platinum blonde wig. So this Roberta Breitmore character that she invented was one that she herself first played for several years by donning this makeup and this wig and this dress. And ultimately, however, other people would also come to embody or inhabit the character of Roberta Breitmore. But for the first few years, it was Lynn Hershman herself embodying this persona. And the persona was imagined as a sort of hypersexualized woman who reflected a lot of the culture of the early 70s. And as Roberta Breitmore, Lynn Hershman engaged in lots of daily activities, including going to Weight Watchers meetings and doing all of these things that were kind of coded with feminine identity in the early 70s. So this character, this persona of Roberta Breitmore was made real through sort of the lived activity. So that's reflected in the fact. So one thing that Roberta Breitmore did was go and get an interim driver's license from the DMV in San Francisco. So here's an image of Roberta Breitmore's interim license. And another lived activity that Roberta Breitmore performed was going to a psychiatrist's office. And that was also, I think, imagined as something that was really encoded with feminine stereotypes of the early 1970s. And in the psychiatrist's office, Roberta Breitmore developed all of these habits and gestures that were specific to her and that kind of reflected her imagined history of childhood abuse. So Roberta Breitmore, the persona, had not only a face and a wig that were specific to this character, but also a whole sort of gestural embodiment that kind of reflected an inner lived life. So that's really interesting. I think that's kind of an interesting one to sit and look at. And this is an image of later in the series, which lasted until roughly 1978. Later in the period, Lynn Hershman Leeson hired other people to inhabit the persona of Roberta Breitmore, kind of reflecting the idea that it was a persona that could be adopted by anyone. It wasn't specifically necessarily an alter ego of Lynn Hershman herself. It was an identity that could be adopted and performed, a persona, like a theatrical mask, you know? So this is an image of multiple Robertas. So what's always been really interesting to me about this piece is how it reflects a lot of the concerns that I have in my own life as a youngish woman living in the internet age, because I feel that I myself, even 40 years later, am also compelled to use makeup and certain gestural performances to perform feminine identity in a certain way. And so I think it's really interesting and affecting to me how this piece encodes the performance that is part of being a woman. And also, as I said before, how the way this thing looks, so sort of like her face has been disfigured and violence has been enacted upon it, reflects to me how, in my experience, I find it also true that performing feminine identity is also often involves acts of violence upon your body. But another thing that is relevant to my own lived experience about this piece is this part of it about how Roberta her identity was kind of substantiated, not just through her kind of donning of makeup and a wig and her performance as a woman, but also insofar as she existed as a surveillance target and how she left kind of institutionalized traces of herself by existing in the world. For example, the driver's license or a psychiatrist's record of how she behaved. This idea that our identity only sort of exists insofar as we're surveilled and observed by institutions or by other people. And so that to me really is evocative of our lives today, that we live online, and the way that, you know, if you're part of social media and living your life on the internet, that you only exist really insofar as you get a certain number of likes, or insofar as you are observed and validated, and insofar as your data is consumed and collected by institutions. So that seems to me almost even a more prophetic and profound aspect of this work. And I wanted to point out that this aspect about Roberta as a surveillance target, and like the fact that the reality of Roberta is substantiated through her interacting and being surveilled by institutions like the DMV, that presages a lot of Lynn Hershman Leeson's later work, which has really engaged with the idea of surveillance and data on the internet. So some of you may be familiar with some of her later work that's engaged with those ideas, but I wanted to point out that she has this really interesting piece at the De Young right now in this great show called The Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI. And when I saw this piece, I was just amazed. So this piece called Shadow Stalker was originally shown at this alternative arts venue called The Shed in New York City, and it's now part of this show at the De Young. So in this room at the De Young, it's open until mid-February, so I encourage you all to go. You walk into this room and you're encouraged to enter your email address into a computer there. And then when you enter your email address, all of the data that's available about you on the internet is projected onto the wall in the shape of a bodily form, like you see on the wall there. So some of the data that is projected on the wall there includes like your credit score, your home address, also what physical locations you've been in recently, if your phone has been tracking you. Also, if there's any crime, police data, crimes that you've committed recently. So it's all projected onto the wall into this bodily form. And so this is a really interesting example of the work that Lynn Hershman Leeson does now, which is all about kind of critiquing and resisting the new kind of economic order of what she calls surveillance capitalism, and pointing out how our personal data has become the most valuable capital in the world. And so I just wanted to point out that there's a really interesting and important connection between Roberta Breitmore series and this later work that she's done about surveillance capitalism, because they're both really about how identity is constructed and substantiated in our modern world only by our existence in these surveillance kind of spaces, and insofar as we are surveilled and monitored and controlled by institutions. And that's only become more true, I think, with the rise of the internet. So I wanted to just put in a plug for this really great show at the De Young called The Uncanny Valley, which is up until late October. And this piece by Lynn Hershman Leeson is kind of the grand finale of the whole show, but there are a bunch of artists in it that are dealing with similar issues about artificial intelligence and the plight of the individual human in the world of artificial intelligence. So that's sort of it. But just to wrap up, I'll just say that this piece has always really affected me on an emotional level as a young woman who lives in an internet age of surveillance capitalism. So, thank you, Wayne, for the correction about the room at the Dante Hotel. It's room 46, not room 47. I appreciate that. So before I wrap up, are there any questions?
Great background. I loved it.
Good.
I maybe think that surveillance might be too strong a word for the early set.
Right.
I mean, she's not being surveilled. She's actually trying to connect with the world outside to create an identity.
Right. By applying for a driver's license, for example.
Yeah. So they're not like overseeing her. She's trying to get to the point where she becomes part of that world.
But the only way that she can make Roberta Breitmore like a fully fleshed out individual is by interacting with these bureaucracies and institutions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They haven't yet come to, haven't yet been attacking her or trying to get her stuff. Not yet.
Right.
That's the internet age.
Right.
But it's a wonderful segue.
Yeah. Any thoughts about?
Questions? Can I ask 2 questions, Twyla?
Yes.
Twyla. One is, did you, when you went to the DeYoung show and saw the piece there, did you enter your email address or were you afraid to have it put up there on the screen?
I was afraid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's worth a cocktail swig. But the other question I have is when you were talking about, 40 years ago, and what kind of progress do you think has been made in the feminist movement? Some, a little, not much, a lot?
I think the opposite of progress. I think it's even worse, and it's even more so true in a world of Instagram and social media that, we need to construct our faces and our identities in a certain way in order to attract a certain number of followers and to sort of validate our identities and our existences through this act of constructing and performing femininity in a culturally prescribed way.
Yeah.
So I think it's maybe, I wasn't alive then, but I think it's worse. What do you think?
I don't think it's improved. I don't know if it's worse. I think the social media and the internet has hugely influenced, the progress of feminism, but I do see some positive changes. I think there was another person on the chat that was saying there's been some movement with the fat image.
Body positivity.
Body positivity, right? Thanks. So there's been some little minor steps, but certainly not enough. And I think the #MeToo year was sort of helpful, but just a beginning. And now I'm concerned that it's been kind of dropped.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen enough of it lately.
Speaking of #MeToo, that reminds me of something I wanted to say about the piece. So this piece is a part of a series. So you'll see many different copies of this construction chart. As you'll see, there's this one in the image with multiple Robertas. This was one that was hanging in the DeYoung in the 1970s. But something that's unique about the one that's in the Rosa Collection, it has this inscription in the top left. So that is written in pen to this character, Mr. Carson, who was a powerful person in the art world with whom Lynn Hershman Leeson was engaged in sort of a flirtatious dance at the time. And so she inscribed this particular edition with this inscription to Mr. Carson. So that's an interesting tidbit about the particular one that we have in our own collection.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'm almost out of time. But thank you so much. Are there any other questions?
Take a sip.
What?
Take a sip.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir. Will do.
I think it's terrific. I mean, I never quite got into it. And you, in the background you gave me, makes me very appreciative of the whole process now.
Good. Yeah, it's a bit oblique when you just look straight at it, and it sort of looks like kind of a silly vanity project or something, but.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see that comment about Cindy Sherman. In one of the interviews I was reading in preparation for this, there was an extended riff from Lynn Hershman where she said, most people didn't see this kind of performance as art. They thought I was schizophrenic until 5 years later when Cindy Sherman did a similar thing. Yeah, I see that about remote work. That's an interesting point, Sarah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, you know, I was just thinking about, I appreciate the history and the context as other folks were saying, but I'm even just thinking about like the setup of the room and like the extents to which people are going about that on a really daily basis right now, to have people like have this
Curated performance of their space.
And like perhaps a curated like look from the waist up or something, right? Last year, and thinking just about how have people been performing femininity through a pandemic and a racial uprising, and that even amongst all of that, that this is still something that's such a part of daily life in a really just like evolving way is something.
And the performance of femininity in a professional context is still so important for like professional advancement on Zoom calls and stuff.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Totally. Okay, well, thank you so much. And next Thursday, we're going to talk about David Best's Rhino Car, and we're going to make the cocktail of all cocktails called the kitchen sink. So it has just about everything in it. So we'll look forward to that one. So thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you
It was great.
next week. Thank you.